Hi, my name is Andrew King. We're going to be speaking this evening about the future of Canadian cities, what that may mean. We're going to just do a few introductions. I'm the Chief Design Officer for LeMay. I'm also the Director of Fieldwork, LeMay's Research and Innovation wing within the practice, and Professor of Practice at McGill University School of Architecture.
I'm Brenda Webster, and I lead Stantec's Urban Places here in Toronto, so the Toronto office, and very excited to be talking about future of cities with you this evening. Actually, I don't know if it's evening, but it's evening for us.
It's evening for us.
Yeah.
Scano, Sego, Segoli, Songwenko, Matthew Hickey-Giasso, Hadne Songwehoma-Giasso. My name is Matthew Hickey. I'm Gayan Mohawk from Six Nations. I'm an architect with an Indigenous architecture firm called Two Row Architect. And I'm also a tenure track professor at OCAD University. And very excited to speak with my colleagues here tonight.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation. We've got lots of views. We've had a few conversations, so we know. I think we know how interesting and exciting this is going to be. I think also even how contentious a question it's going to be. Are we talking about a series of crises, as we seem to be, or are we talking about a more linear or at least positive future? I think, Brenda, maybe there's a few things about the city we were discussing earlier. Maybe you can step
Sure,
in and have a little
absolutely.
observations on maybe what the future of the Canadian city might mean. I think if we can, maybe by the end of this, maybe actually talk about what that C word means, the Canadian part of that question, because I think that's also interesting.
Very good. I would say we talked earlier about water before this started, and to me, the sponge city, the water city, what is water to our cities? And not just the Canadian city, but all cities in the world. Cities are organisms, and we are organisms, and a lot of us are water, and we can't survive without it. So for us to talk about the future of the city and collect around water, I think many conversations through many different communities and cultures across Canada land on that word. And that's something we're going to explore this evening for sure. I don't know if you want to pick up on that.
I mean, I completely agree with you. And there's something we were talking about earlier where you said water is a gift and we don't treat it that way.
Yeah.
And if you think about Indigenous communities, even their lack of water, but also our relationship to the water,
Yeah.
Women are water carriers and keepers, and
Yeah.
it's a gift for us. Without it, we wouldn't be here.
Exactly.
You know, we often talk about land as the most important thing, but we have this beautiful interface between land and water, and if we're not treating water or not treating it like a gift, I don't think that we're going to give it the respect that it deserves.
Exactly. And just before I turn it back to you, Andrew, I was thinking something else we talked about, which was that even how we describe it, the words we use to describe this gift that we have. In engineering, Stantec, the company I lead Urban Places in, is a very, it's engineering based, and we talk about water as stormwater. But then I said, well, let's reflect for a moment. It's actually rainwater. We have storms, but we also have gentle rain. So let's see how we can contain that water. And there are many different ways that we're starting to innovate and explore the kind of containment of water, how to deal with resilience, how to make sponge landscapes that we can all benefit from. Over to you, the lab of the sponge landscape.
Yeah, well, I think the notion of well, first of all, just riffing on the water thing a little bit, Matthew, we worked, actually, I taught Wanda Della Costa, and we
Yes.
met with Wanda on a few occasions, and she had this great, it was about a half an hour discussion around the relationship between a female-led culture, the relationship of water, and the relationship of that to how you can develop a community. And we were talking specifically about the Quayside project here in Toronto at one point, or around a particular proposition. But it was really an interesting way to talk about not just this notion that water comes in and moves back into the river system or moves back into the ocean or does whatever, but that actually the water pushes back into the city, or should now, as we start to readdress the way we're dealing with our cities, push back into and reframe the cities, particularly Toronto. We seem to be in Toronto. That's all. I think I see it's 3 times we see the word Toronto. Yeah. So I guess we're in Toronto here. But this notion that that Toronto has been ignoring its waterfront. You can say the same for Montreal. You can say the same for many cities, Rome. But this notion that has to be pulled back in, and that relationship has to be kind of inverted. But yeah, to the notion of, because for me, we talked about a few issues, but for me, in some of the discussions that we've had in the last few months, both or in many ways driven by the COVID situation,
Yeah.
but also driven by this notion, because that was the first 6 months. Everybody's hair was on fire, and we're going, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? But then everything started to settle down. And you said, okay.
It's kind of nice.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it was ever nice.
I don't know.
It's nice, nice to put pants on for the first time in a while. But it was a kind of notion that that the city can become, if it does one thing, it says the city can become a laboratory, right? We had all sorts of questions around, how are we going to respond? How are we going to respond? And what seemed to be really clear is one of the things we're not doing very well is responding quickly. So how do you actually create an environment in a city where the city can function as a true laboratory? Mm-hmm. So we can talk about policy or things like that maybe a little bit later on, but for me it was just about saying, well, why can't the city be a series of beta tests? Why can't the city be a series of laboratories? And I know, your practice is essentially suggesting that there's a place for the laboratory within the practice to test things. Matthew, I know that you're doing similar things, the sort of convergence of teaching and your practice within Turo. And for me, certainly, I'm building a practice model around that mechanism, that the notion of provocation, speculation, the notion of asking these questions, the notion of actually asking a question and then have that question end with another series of questions that move us sort of quite rapidly into some sort of future. So, I guess, I'll try and do my job as a moderator and ask questions. But so where do you think that lands? Like, what do you think the laboratory, if the city is a laboratory, if we think we can make it a laboratory, A, how do we do that? And B, what do you think the questions are we should be asking?
Yeah, for me, I think we've been doing things the same way for so long, and we're not getting any better at doing these, practicing the way we put pipes in the ground, the way that we pave roads, how big they need to be, the way we treat cars or parking. And I completely agree with you. We need to test different ideas out for this day and age, especially, and I think COVID gave us an opportunity to do this with less cars on the road. We're seeing more people wanting to be outside. And I live on Richmond Street, right downtown Toronto. It's as paved as you can get. The trees are in concrete planters, and it's really uninspiring. It doesn't feel healthy. It doesn't feel healthy for not just humans, but also our relations that I believe a city, we should be keeping place for them as well, the pollinators, the ones with wings, all of these other animals that we share this world with. So, I was walking home one day. I'd just been in Vancouver. It's so lovely and green there and lush. And I'm like, well, we've got a bike lane on Richmond now. We've got a lane of parking, and we've got one lane that's basically taken up by the barrier. Like, is there not a way we can use infrastructure, green infrastructure, where we can combine these processes of our water, how we collect it, how we treat it as a gift, how we put it back in the earth in a way that it's really something that we haven't been doing in a city before. So I think there's definitely an opportunity for us to do that in an urban realm as an urban lab.
Yeah, and I think that this idea of, our relations, as you mentioned, before joining Stantec, I was with Waterfront Toronto, and we were developing, bringing the river, and we called the river the agent of urbanism. And that just stayed with me, and I couldn't get away from it, that water is the agent of our urbanism, and green is the agent of our urbanism. And once we begin to turn it on its head, we can all be researchers and scientists, whether, it's a community putting leaves on the pavement to tighten up the road, or whether it's a much grander plan. It seems to me that there are citizens of this city who are already beginning to understand that notion and do their own, guerrilla gardening or whatever it is. Like, there's so many different, when you started talking about laboratory, I was thinking about, when is there success? When is the point where there's a balance between us in the community and the sort of planning policies, as you say? Because if it's only the policies, it may not stick, like with Quayside, that maybe you need a real balance between it coming from everybody and, and as well as from the policies, and they meet in the middle somehow.
There's this notion about, I guess the shift to the river becoming was it a magnet for urbanism? Or
Agent.
an
It's the agent. Like water is our agent. Whether we're trying to, you know, sometimes I say that, you know, it was putting the water in the pipes in the first place that was our downfall. Like
Exactly.
it
No,
seemed
for
like
sure.
it was the right thing to do, and we built these aqueducts, and we had this whole idea that if we could just get rid of that water, things would be wonderful. And now we're waking to the fact that we need that water, and it's imperative for life. And it, you know, what is the record? Like I think you can't survive more than a certain number of hours without water.
That's vodka.
No, but you know, you can survive without heat, you can survive without owning land, you can survive with all these things, but water, and we're on the Great Lakes, so as the City of Toronto, you know, we should be at the vanguard. We should be the laboratory for that.
We're having these conversations in our lab in field work, which is our laboratory. And one of the things we're looking at are cities in crisis. And right now, strangely enough, we're looking at Calgary on one side and Beirut on the other. A couple of different reasons why each of those cities are feeling some form of crisis. But it begs the question for the water, because the key question, one of the conversations I had today around Beirut with Charles, one of my collaborators, was really about urbanism as a kind of inclusionary device. And I'm wondering if we say water is the agent for urbanism, can that urbanism be more fundamentally inclusive, fundamentally flatter, fundamentally sort of something that recalibrates either a post-colonial, I mean, to use those words that are flying around, to recalibrate a city around something that, you know, I don't want to say more natural or more, you know, you don't want to over-romanticize it, but it does become something that hopefully just becomes flatter from a kind of inclusionary sense. Because it is, I mean, there are some countries where obviously water becomes a commodity pretty quickly, but I think we still live in a country where that doesn't happen, I hope.
Well, we're a little bit. People
a little
do
bit.
buy water,
No,
and
you know,
there's some very shocking examples.
No,
where,
I understand that, but
yeah.
as I'm saying it, I'm reflecting, I'm going,
yeah.
I'm wrong, actually. I guess so. But the
I
question,
know what you mean. It doesn't feel like it. Like someone gave me this glass of water.
So how can it be though? How can we not force it to be, but how can we say, okay, water is an agent? And maybe it's not just an agent for urbanism, but it's something to talk about. I mean, I've got a whole list of notes here about the crises we want to talk about, maybe. But what do you think, Matt?
I mean, the funny thing is for me is that we're always talking about trying to save the earth. You know, save the earth, do this so we can be greener. And in reality, we should be talking about how do we save the human species. There's a great diagram that I use a lot that has a drop of water, has a tree, has a bee, and then it has a human. And we're the only one in those four pieces that could be taken away, and the world will still go on without a care.
COVID,
right?
I mean, right in our
Absolutely.
face, right? Like, I mean, we're the only ones that are suffering. The world has actually repaired itself during this time.
Absolutely.
Right across the board.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think that's really interesting for your lab concept too, is to compare what's been happening. We've still had crises, you know, like one of the projects we're working on is Fort McMurray redevelopment plan, and we started before the flood, and then the flood happened. And before the flood, we said, you know, this is a flood zone. And they said, oh, no, don't worry, it never floods here. You know, it's just, I think using that idea of the water as the agent for more than just urbanism starts to help, you know, calibrate all our planning principles. Like right away, if you're talking about that, things start to get, you know, the tumblers start to click into place.
And the other thing that I think is that it is a more natural process. We don't need to necessarily call it that, but we've been relying on technology for so long, even like the controlling of the Don River. We were like, well, let's put some concrete barriers up and look what we can do as humans, and we can control this. And in reality, we can't control these things. And I think
nature's laughing at us.
Nature is always laughing at us. The moment we start thinking, how do we align our processes, the way we think about design, the way we talk about design with more natural systems, the better off we're going to be. The moment we try and fight nature or control it, it will take over our lives in a real easy way. So this is one of the reasons I think we should be, you know, pulling some of that asphalt out of our cities, thinking about how we can use our extra spaces, our parking lots, those extra lanes that we don't need anymore or won't need in 10 years when we have self-driving cars, to start to experiment with these different forms of natural technologies, if you will.
And you know what, we're at that point, and I mean, I think this is why it's such a good time for your lab, because we're at that point where we can measure, predict what nature will do. And so we're at that point where we can say we no longer need to work against nature, we can work with it because we know how to work with it. We know how to make a breathing building. We know how to, like you were saying earlier, build the channels in. And we have plenty of pre-oil, pre-Roman examples to pick on. Obviously with software and with the ability to, hire mathematics, we can fairly clearly predict. And there's plenty of people who would be on our side to move forward with that.
Absolutely, and I think we've realized that going the other way doesn't work very well.
yeah, exactly.
I mean, we were laughing about one of the early deities of Rome being, cloaca, the notion of the cloaca, the notion of when you put the sewer system in, that was the beginning of the civilization of that
Beginning
city.
of the end, in fact.
And that's what. So you revel in that, and you say, "Oh, that's interesting." It's quite pragmatic. It's very Roman in that sense. It's not. It's not ecclesiastical in any way. It's saying there's a piece of infrastructure that becomes the thing that is the heart of the city, and now we're saying, well, that's been overdone, right? Like at a certain point, we want to move back to, I guess, we're supposed to be talking about the future of Canadian cities, and I think this is really relevant because in the end, what's more Canadian than a kind of some understanding of the natural systems, or at least...
Exactly, like living up to the image that the world has of Canadian cities. The image is there, and we're not there yet, but we certainly aspire to it. And, we don't want to be Luddites, but I don't think that's what this conversation is about. It's really about harnessing water in all its forms.
Yeah, and for me, I mean, I always say that we have thousands of years of knowledge here that we haven't really been using with our Indigenous cultures here in Canada, North America, all around the world. It's been kind of looked at as lesser than because it's not based in technology or technologies that we don't understand. So I think that we're finally hitting a pivot point, and I'm not saying we go back and do things exactly the way that it was done in the past, because that's not Indigenous at all. We would be using technologies and ideas that can be aligned with Western ways of thinking, and using the best of both worlds to move forward, to think about things in a different way, to think about our relations to the water, to the land, to all the animals around us, and doing it in a really smart way where you're taking advantage of both streams of knowledge. There's some power in that.
I was listening to one of the About Buildings and Cities podcasts just on my way to Toronto last night, and there was a kind of riffing on the notion of the inclusion of some components of history and giving others away. Even when we started with LEED and we started with these sustainability strategies, everybody started, oh, look at this, it's a thermal chimney. And you sort of look at that and you go back to Rome and you say, the thermal chimney was one of the primary understandings of how the space was going to work, the big thermal mass, these basic fundamentals, which now we're sort of making into a series of checkpoints.
How do you turn from the passive house to the passive city? Right? Like, to me, that's really interesting, the idea of like that chimney, which is part of passive house, right? And what we're really saying is, we can actually just step back for a little bit here, right? Because when we were all locked up during COVID, and the city kind of repaired itself, and the water got cleaner, and the birds were singing louder.
And the fish returned to Venice.
Yes, the fish returned to Venice. People
when I was
were
in
fishing
Venice, the last thing you would have expected to see would be a fish.
I could smell the ocean, the stars were out, so absolutely. I mean, I think there's this, the fear is that we don't record this and harness it and pay attention to it and live it, that we live this new way. If we continue to live this new way, not being sick, obviously, but all the other aspects, we have a chance.
Well, that was going to be sort of where I wanted to go as moderator. Was this notion of, so what does this mean? Because there's a version of this world that we're talking about, which is very kind of beautiful, slow, and we sort of progress through a kind of vision of the world which embraces Western and embraces Indigenous and embraces this way of looking at the world, which we know now are much better lessons. But how slowly can we get there? Or does this need to be? Are we in this state of crisis? I mean, I just started writing down the crises, right? The economic crisis, the climate crisis, a crisis of identity, specifically indigeneity, this notion about how we're starting to understand these worlds in new ways. We've understood them, they've been there. I'm an immigrant, but I've been in Canada for a very long time. We've understood these issues as being part of it, but is there a kind of radical kind of acceleration process that we need to go? And we're having this talk. I watched a talk just before this being recorded around similar issues. Is it time to accelerate those discussions and say, we have to flatten and expand the leadership of this and actually bring these things forward? I specifically around some of the notions you're talking about, Matthew, specifically about around this notion. I mean, I love the talk you had, Brenda, about saying that in front of your house there's the stormwater drain and
Right.
the tree.
Yeah.
The water's all going down the stormwater drain
And the
super
tree's
efficiently, and the tree is dying.
And I'm just like, I want to literally lift
like
the
the-
drain up and pass the water over to the
But
tree.
it's almost Python-esque, right? Monty
Yeah.
Python-esque.
Yeah.
The absurdity of that
And
convergence.
over and over, like think of, oh, this
No,
is
every
the
time
thing
it
about-
rains, every time it rains,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
see
yeah,
the comedic metaphor, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so
and this is the idea of rapid micro change, right? Like if everybody did that with every tree right away, that's why this flat idea of yours is connected to the micro idea. So the ideas could be large, they could be planning principles. Some of the simple ones we've had in Toronto is the plastic bag, which we talked about a bit, you know. But you know, there are these micro moves or these particular planning moves that will have that rapid effect. And that's the fun, chasing that, researching that, and moving with that.
Yeah, I always struggle with seeing things at a city level because the bureaucracy is so slow to change, and I don't think we have the time to do that.
Yeah.
Our policies need to shift, and they need to shift now, and that's a major restructuring of many different departments within our municipalities that need to switch the way that they basically think about things. You know, we've been, as I said earlier, we've been thinking about or trying to do things the same way for so long, and it's not working. And now we know we can do things differently.
Yeah.
And I think this is where the lab comes in. We need to start testing these pieces in different areas.
Yeah.
And I bet most of them will work. We can predict how water is going to move. We can predict how it's going to slow down, what it's going to turn out like. So I think there's an opportunity for us to really shift and really
to do
push.
It with like tactical urbanism, like to act now, ask questions later.
Yeah.
You know, like, well, I mean, King Street, quite frankly, was a little bit like that, right?
Absolutely.
Like, so I mean, and it worked. Like, that is where we're at now in terms of this lab. To me, lab is one-to-one. You know, like that's the way it works. That you get out there and you test it, and people react to it, and then you test it again, and then you calibrate, and you just it tells itself kind of which way to go, you know.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, there's a difference between technology and nature. I don't think nature will ever fail us. Nature's always trying to make itself work. It's trying to grow. It's doing these things that are based
against
in
all odds.
its survival, right?
it's occasionally trying to kill us while
fair
it's
enough.
doing that. But
Well, we obviously did something bad. So.
Fair enough.
But this notion of the laboratory, I mean, we're talking about our labs, and really the role of field work within my much larger firm, which I'm, you know, part of the executive team of, but is to actually find that place where you can actually, because I think it's about risk too, right?
Yeah.
It's about taking risk. It's about finding this mechanism to do that in this construct. And I think your practices do that.
We have
too,
like
to some
this
degree.
thing called innovation, where it's called the Idea Lab, and you can, submit. Like we have 22,000 people. Anybody can submit any day, and then if someone thinks it has value, you get a call. Okay, can you show us how it works? You know, it's a bit like Dragon's Den or something.
And we're doing that with clients, right? Clients will come to us with a prickly problem that says, we don't know what this is, but we know the way you think, and we want you to think about this with us. And you know, luckily we get to do it together. But to that point about policy in the city, and actually suggesting that the city needs to have these kind of you call them task forces or whatever it is, whatever plural of task forces. You can call them the A-team, whatever you want to do, right? But you say, okay, we need to function more quickly because everything is preposterously slow and the responses are preposterously slow. And we are, like, I want to ask questions about how the future of Canadian cities, I'm looking for that, it doesn't say it there, but the future of the Canadian city, is it about controlling a series of crises? Or is it about, that notion of, we talk a lot about placemaking, and now the word that people use a lot is placekeeping, this notion that there's a kind of softer understanding of the city and we can move gradually towards it, or do we want to move more rapidly? So I guess the provocation would be, and I know what I would say, is that as designers, as architects, as urbanists, as whatever, how radical do we want to be? How much do we want to turn how much do we think we have to make those, you know, actually,
well,
what is it, shoot now and ask questions later, or whatever it is? Or?
Well, so the flatness is also, you know, almost place telling. It's almost, because you don't want it to be keeping, you don't want it to be static, you want it to be regenerative, the way we talk about regenerative farming. And so in a way, by, you know, sort of understanding the land as designers and knowing which acts make sense where, we can get there at ground level, as you say, with our clients, or with, you know, in the public sector with the community. We have this expression, designing with community in mind, and I keep saying, can we just cross out the in mind part? Because I just want to go in there and design with them, you know, because then you get subject matter expertise. And there are probably plenty of people, I mean, once you lay the ground rules and you say, you know, water is important, you know, like where you can start to get to, I don't know, I kind of like placemaking, because I think place telling, placemaking, like I think you want to move forward. I guess I don't really understand that expression, placekeeping.
So for me, placekeeping is very much about a different way of thinking, and I think that that's what we need to do. There needs to be a paradigm shift, even in the words that we use. You know,
oh, for sure,
it
like rainwater.
Is it rainwater? So placekeeping for me is understanding that the place is already here and reminding us that the earth is going to go on without us.
Right.
You know, whether we screw this up or not,
I guess that's
it'll
the
be
place
fine.
telling. I was thinking of it as place telling. Like the place is already telling us what this should be. Like the sculptor with the rock, or, you know, like it's already got all the messages you could possibly need. You just have to slow down and read the microclimate and where the flood is and all those things.
I completely agree. And I mean, and talking to community, I love, you know, community for me is what really drives our design work. And the more people we can speak to, it's a little bit of a cheat, the easier it gets.
It's true,
you know,
it's true. Everybody thinks, oh, it's so hard talking to the community. I'm like, oh, you're right, that's a great idea. You know, like you're gathering thoughts.
Taking the time to listen is very important. Taking the time to gather those thoughts, organize them. And I mean, I see our job as designers, architects, urban planners, as to kind of bring the ones that are going to work to the top without any arrogance, but just making sure that you're open to listening and hearing these new ideas.
The urban Ouija board.
Yeah. We're in the middle of a project, the Place de Montréal in Montreal, which is a big public plaza, and it's about inclusion. It's got some great stories. It's about a new way of recalibrating the city around our histories. And it's about the complete inclusion of art strategies and landscape strategies and architecture at the same time. But one of the things that, I guess, you know, if we had just a minute left or a little bit of time left, one thing it is fearless. There's a kind of notion that there's a kind of bravery or fearlessness to some projects. And it seems to me that if we are going to understand this, that these are, you know, very beautiful notions that could have a kind of slower time frame, but we need to fearlessly push them forward rapidly. That seems to me to be my understanding of this, and that's the only thing that I would do around some of the words that we're shifting. Certainly, if we're going to talk about the future of the Canadian city specifically.
I think being brave with your clients, which you said earlier too. You know, if someone's asking you to design something that's in a floodplain, you very honestly say to them, "Are you sure this is what you want to do? Because this is going to be flooded, and it's going to make the flood worse. So let's look at this. What is the best use of this land? You know, and it." You know, we were talking about the economic crisis, ecologic crisis. I mean, I know, you know, Suzuki and many others talk about this. The two are the same, right? Like economy, ecology, they just mirror each other, and trying to keep them apart from each other is not helping.
Yeah,
Matthew, I've seen you walk into the room and be immediately very brave, so how do you feel?
I mean, I think we're at that tipping point from, I think everyone's starting to get it, including municipalities, where they're seeing the benefits, whether they're financial benefits, you know, reduction in maintenance. You know, they don't really think maybe about the increased green space or the way that the systems are going to work to filter out water, but I think people are just starting to tip, and I'm very excited to see this change.
I agree. I think there's so many thresholds we seem to be just sort of shifting into. This conversation is one of them. There's client understanding is another one. My students, we were all involved in the university. The shifts there. There's so much sort of really, really insightful, sort of provocative thought going on there. So I think, I'm not quite sure if we're in good shape for the future of Canadian cities. If you guys were in control, we would be, but you know, we'll see where it goes. I'd like to thank Matthew and Brenda. This was a great discussion. Thank you very much, you guys. And hopefully this will become part of a continual discussion. And thank you all, and hopefully you'll enjoy the conversation.